Information astronauts need to know before going into space. Astronauts receive special training to work in space. Astronauts in space have a system to produce the oxygen necessary for life. Astronauts must follow special procedures in space regarding eating, sleeping patterns, exercising, and personal hygiene. There is no gravity in space, so astronauts must do special exercises to prevent their bodies from weakening. In space, astronauts have to deal with radiation. In space, astronauts use special filters to reduce the number of airborne pathogens. Space suits protect astronauts against temperature changes in space. Astronauts receive special training to work in space. Astronauts in space have a system to produce the oxygen necessary for life. Astronauts must follow special procedures in space regarding eating, sleeping patterns, exercising, and personal hygiene. There is no gravity in space, so astronauts must do special exercises to prevent their bodies from weakening. In space, astronauts have to deal with radiation. In space, astronauts use special filters to reduce the number of airborne pathogens. Space suits protect astronauts against temperature changes in space. Astronauts must enter a pressurized chamber before boarding the spacecraft. Astronauts use special filters for combustion products, such as carbon dioxide, from the combustion of any substance in space. Astronauts in space have special diet plans to replace the calcium and other minerals their bodies have lost. Astronauts use special armored coatings in space to protect against damage caused by high-speed micrometeoroids and space debris. In space, astronauts' senses may change. For example, the taste and smell of food may change. In space, astronauts' heart rates can drop, making it difficult to carry enough oxygen to the tissues. Astronauts should check their watches regularly when working in space, because there is no concept of days and nights. There are risks to the eye health of astronauts in space. For example, vision loss may occur. Astronauts should be wary of dehydration when working in space. In space, astronauts must wear special clothing to avoid carrying static electricity against surfaces. If astronauts go on a long-term mission in space, they may need to grow their own food in space. Astronauts in space researched human psychology and behavior. Astronauts must be prepared for the encounter with the spacecraft of other countries in space. There are special systems for astronauts to communicate in space. In space, astronauts should regularly inspect and maintain their astronaut equipment. Astronauts use specially designed tools and equipment when working in space. In space, astronauts' bodily fluids can move in different ways than normal, as there is no gravity. Astronauts receive special training to repair astronaut equipment and vehicles in space. In space, astronauts use special propulsion systems to stay in orbit of their spacecraft. Astronauts must be mindful of air pollution during missions in space. In space, astronauts use special protective shields as they may be exposed to high levels of radiation. Astronauts must follow special procedures to protect against solar flares when working in space. In space, astronauts must regularly perform flight checks for the safety of the spacecraft. Astronauts are specially trained to perform high-risk missions while working in space. As astronauts may encounter various dangers during their missions in space, they receive training in crisis management. Astronauts must be specifically motivated to achieve their personal and professional goals while working in space. In space, astronauts' bodies adapt specifically to accommodate prolonged weightlessness. Astronauts are informed about how their research while working in space can benefit humanity. In space, astronauts can collaborate with astronauts from other countries in space. Astronauts must be prepared for natural disasters while working in space. In space, astronauts use specially designed computer systems to control the motion of their spacecraft. Astronauts consume foods specially designed for eating in space and recycle water. In space, astronauts use special systems to clean the air in the spacecraft. Astronauts receive special training in how to measure time while working in space. In space, astronauts use special devices to monitor their performance during their missions. Astronauts can receive psychological support and counseling while working in space. In space, astronauts dispose of waste from the spacecraft with special systems. Astronauts follow special procedures to maintain their sleep patterns while working in space. In space, astronauts use specially designed navigation systems to keep the spacecraft in correct orbit. Astronauts follow special protocols to communicate with each other while working in space. In space, astronauts wear special suits to protect against the atmospheric conditions of the spacecraft. Astronauts use special systems to properly store equipment and supplies while working in space. Astronauts use specially designed telescopes and other devices to make observations while working in space. In space, astronauts are constantly trained to deal with a variety of challenges. Astronauts are subject to long-term health checks as their bodies are exposed to various effects while working in space. In space, astronauts need to know that time moves differently because of the high velocities created by the motion of the spacecraft. Astronauts have to get enough exercise while working in space because they lose muscle and bone in space. In space, astronauts constantly observe to identify and avoid hazards around the spacecraft. When working in space, astronauts perform routine maintenance to make sure their life support systems are working properly. In space, astronauts receive special training on how to act in a spacecraft emergency. Astronauts use specially designed systems to consume enough water while working in space. In space, astronauts can get out of spacecraft to perform certain tasks during their mission. When working in space, astronauts develop their collaboration skills to work collaboratively with other team members. In space, astronauts do different activities to improve the quality of life in spacecraft. While working in space, astronauts track how atmospheric conditions change in different parts of the spacecraft. In space, astronauts use special systems to meet the energy needs of spacecraft. Astronauts participate in various research projects and conduct scientific experiments while working in space. In space, astronauts learn the skills necessary to survive off Earth. While working in space, astronauts learn to respect cultural differences by working with team members from different cultures. In space, astronauts constantly use processes